Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Guardbeardia. It's me, your narrator, the Beldam, and this is Chapter 7, Part 2, and I'll let Guardbeardia take over with our sponsor.
And that I will. Of course, as you guys are all aware by now, we are more or less sort of sponsored / affiliated with Redcon 1, a supplement website that caters to walks of all life, including gamer fuel nowadays. There's also a discount for first responders, military, and veterans if you're into that kind of thing. But the most important thing about Redcon 1 is that it allows you to get the things you need when you can't get them, such as food. I myself are using the MRE protein powders to try and get my calories through the day. Plus, there are times when you just don't want to cook, but you still have to eat. Or, you're so damn busy you ain't got time to cook. And the best thing about Redcon 1 protein powders is that they use actual animal proteins, none of this soy bull that no one wants in their system. So when you want actual food, real food on the go that tastes great and can be drank with all kinds of liquids, Redcon 1's where you want to go. Down below in the comment section you'll find my discount code just for you so you can try it out and save money on future orders. Remember, Redcon 1, it's food.
Morel flicked a pebble across the road from where she sat with Emily, both of them waiting sourly with their packs and Emily zoomed up while around them people bustled to and fro along the roads of the Las Vegas airport. The letter from Ogledock had not been a good one, and read more as a passionate hate letter from a disapproving college professor than a boss reacting to a field report. As he put it in his letter, Ogledock was close to shitting an entire brick wall over how Morel and Emily had conducted themselves in the field. Morel for wandering off and not bothering to carry a weapon besides a knife in a known cultist combat zone, and Emily for clamping on a magical artifact without vetting it first. After his first letter, Emily replied, which quickly led to an angry email exchange between her and Ogledock. In the end, Ogledock just got madder the more Emily told him about the torque, even getting to the point he forwent his professional typing style and went straight into caps lock-laden spouts of furious keyboard smashing. The more he typed, the more Emily began to wonder if she really did fuck up by wearing the torque after a quick conversation with it. Ogledock used words like possession and mental puppeteering in his last retort, and even had videos linked to what showed the after effects of when magical artifacts went rogue and were unable to be removed. Her nerves were not cooled when she tried to converse with the Torque about the subject, but only got back feelings of indignation in return and nothing else in terms of conversation. Ogledock rammed his frustration home when he told Emily he was changing their transportation plans from their prearranged way back home to Logan, and instead was calling in an audible in order to make sure they wouldn't run the risk of killing anybody with the stuff in their bags. He was especially worried about the little angry box Emily had duct-taped shut and knew only of 2 pilots up to the task of running such objects through the air. Judging by Morel's sourpuss look on her face, Emily knew it was going to be a trip and a half. The 2 were waiting near the bustling airport's special diver cargo section, an outdoor waiting area that seemed to have more fire extinguishers and magical barriers than it did chairs. "So, tell me about these 2 again," Emily asked, looking over at the Centaur from her sidecar. Morel had most of her saddlebags and other gear tucked into a single army duffel, with only the Harpy sling bag around her shoulders. She also wore normal clothes, not even bothering to put on her usual flying outfits. She turned to look at Emily, and she looked extremely peeved. "The Cthulhu sisters, they fly the stone serenade, a CH-53E Super Stallion." Morel grumped and stamped her back hoof lightly. "I can't believe he put us on a helicopter of all things. They don't even make any sense. It's like putting longer blades on a blender and making it carry things around. It's not even a real aircraft." "And they're snake people?" Morel looked down at Emily, her arms crossing as her ears perked to a loud thudding of blades coming their way. "No, they're even worse." "Even worse?" Emily mused, but a flush of air was coming her way as the large lift helicopter began its descent. The Cthulhu sisters seemed to have little care for the comfort of others, bringing their helicopter right down in front of the waiting area and letting the aggressive prop wash roar out into any fool that didn't brace for it. Las Vegas tourists went sprawling across the ground and luggage totaled away as the sisters pulled their descent into an aggressive stop. And by how bowed the blades were, Emily had to bet that they yanked the collective hard on purpose just to cause destruction on those down below. Just as the large sea stallion came to a halt above the ground, it began spinning aggressively to point the rear ramp door towards its passengers, the long rear boom churring above their heads like a demented windmill. Emily keyed up her Zundap as Muriel trotted forward and up the ramp, her hoofs scrabbling a little bit at the incline. Emily clicked her gearbox into first and trundled forward, making sure the booty bag of loot roped to the back of her motorcycle didn't catch on anything or get ripped off in the prop wash. Inside the craft, it was just as noisy and barely dimmed down when she turned off her motorbike. Muriel was fussing with a box of tie-down ratchets when one of the pilots stood up from the cockpit, walking past the gunner positions towards the cargo area. The gunner positions were still weaponized, and Emily could spy 2 robust-looking 50-cal machine guns resting in the cradles. Then she saw the pilot and sat up straight on her seat as she startled. At first, Emily had just thought the pilot had very long and thick dreadlocks that came down to her shoulders, but as she got closer, she began to remember that dreadlocks didn't move on their own or have scales. The Gorgon was lovely looking, as far as Gorgons go, with a pleasant complexion and enough dark chocolate freckles to decorate a mocha latte. Her hair was, of course, a bunch of fucking snakes, and Emily felt her skin crawl as the many eyes turned to all look at her at once. The snakes looked to be some kind of copper-headed variety and were colored beautifully. She must have been using some kind of scale conditioner or something, because they looked way too soft and not as rugged as the copperheads she was used to seeing back home or on the internet. While the eyes of her many snakes were slitted, her own eyes were round like a human's, 2 pools of dark brown hazel honey that glowed when the light hit them. Emily had been expecting a whole other kind of snake person, as she had heard tales of Lamians coming through some of the portals and setting up shop on her Earth. They were master weavers and artists, and she had always wanted to meet one in person. They were more friendly-looking and sinister, while Gorgons were something else entirely. They were entirely human all the way from their toes to their lips, but that was where things got a bit askew. Their fangs, for one, took the place of their canines, and had the kind of venom that made Dungeon and Dragon rogues wet themselves in excitement. Then there was their hair, snakes, tendrils, whatever. That was the second worst part. Each snake tendril was intelligent, able to follow directions with its own little brain, and could even help a Gorgon make calculations. It was rumored their brain could process things so fast with the help of their hair that at times they could make the rest of the world move in slow motion around them, reacting so quickly that even elves got nervous around them. Then, worst of all, were their eyes. One Gorgon, Medusa, had come through via magical error and wound up in Greece during the old eras. She was a master magician and could turn people to stone with just a look. While first thought as mythos, Gorgons who came in with the other races actually had history to back it up, even bringing paintings of Medusa and some of their old writings about the sorceress. They held no hurt feelings of her killing, though, as she was a bit mad with power and they didn't feel sad to see her go. Then they told everyone that any Gorgon had that little spark of magic, and was one of the few magics that still worked on Terra despite the plain disconnect. When she spoke to Emily, her voice was soft and lilting and was an accent she struggled to place. It was as if German had a love child with Afrikaans, then the child spent a summer with its grandparents in Ireland. "Emily Bronze?" Emily squinted as the Gorgon smiled. She could see the glinting fangs that held enough venom to kill a room full of people just by spitting at them. She had to speak a little loudly inside the interior of the cargo hold. "Yeah, that's me, I think." The Gorgon smiled brightly, and it reached all the way up to her crinkling eyes. She tapped the flight suit near her name tape. "I am the Stone Serenade's pilot. My name is Gretchenk. Please tie down your motorcycle and prepare for takeoff. We will be flying in the Earth's nap for the first leg of the journey, till we are over the mountains." "Earth's nap?" Emily asked, having to shout as she heard the engines begin to whine and spool up. Suddenly, Muriel seemed more excited about the flight. "She means nap of the earth! We're going to tickle the chopper's belly with the treetops!" Muriel yelled gleefully and began tying down the Zundap in quick succession. Emily's face went blank, then contorted as she looked up at Muriel, scrambling out of her seat. What? Doesn't that mean if they sneeze wrong, we're dead? Yeah, ain't it great? Muriel cried and trotted over to the gunner's position as Gretchen sat back down in her seat in the cockpit. Emily was not exactly sure if great was the right word to paint on the thought of a quick and gruesome death, but she was starting to realize that Muriel seemed to have different definitions of words than she had. She did, however, join Muriel at the opposite gunner's nest and sat down in a sling seat, looking over to her bike to make sure everything was still in order. Muriel shouted at her and saw that the centaur was pointing to a headset nearby in a small shelf, already having worked the headset at the gunner's nest around her long horsey ears. Emily picked it up and placed the muffs over her own ears, and was alarmed to hear it was being filled with faint hissing, as if there were short bursts of static. There were also soft, crisp clicks with the hisses, and she poked her head around the gangway to the cockpit. To her shock, she found that the hissing and clicking was coming from Gretchen and the other Gorgon pilot, and that the long, snaky tendrils that made up their hair were writhing and wiggling around the top of their heads at a custom control panel that was retrofitted to the top of the pilot seats. As the Gorgons gave their hair commands, the little snakes were toggling and flipping switches with their little mouths, a constant mass of movement that never stopped fiddling with things. Gretchen clicked open a pair of aviators and placed them on her eyes, then made a rapid clicking and hissing noise with her mouth. At once, all of her hair tendrils snapped to their secondary positions, many of which stared at unmoving gauges, and a trio of the Gorgon's hair tendrils were watching a miniature radar set that scrawled with a constant search pattern in some kind of strange language. Emily heard an exasperated man suddenly key up onto the radio channel.
This is the Gorgon chopper, isn't it? Transtone 9983, you know none of us speak Gorgon.
A cackle of laughter erupted from the cockpit. Then the Gorgon pilots began to tease the airport tower controllers. This went on for several minutes before the man just muttered, "Please leave," and cleared them a path out of the airport. "I love when they give up," the other Gorgon said over the channel for both Muriel and Emily to hear. Then the two pilots pulled up their collective and lurched up from the ground. It was when they spun to leave that Emily noticed that they had never once spun their rotors down, and the chaotic disaster they were leaving behind them would be on the minds of many until a heavy amount of whiskey was downed on the strip that night. Emily keyed up her mic and ducked back away from the gunnery hole. "Aren't you guys afraid of getting banned?" "They can't ban us," Gretchen said back, and Emily could almost hear the evil grin she must have had on her face. "No one else brave enough to run the kind of cargo we do." A witchy cackle crackled through Emily's earmuffs, and assumed that the other Gorgon was enjoying the apparent checkmate they had on the flight community. Well, either that, or the fact that she tilted the super stallion into a steep turn, and Emily found herself looking down at cars rushing down below. Muriel screeched happily from behind her, while Emily was screeching because she didn't have her harness on and had both feet planted on either side of the gunnery door, as well as both hands gripping the M2 machine gun and its carriage. "The human is screaming," Gretchen said over the internal communication system, and Emily was in fact doing just that. "Why does she scream? Let's show her Mandalay Bay. Humans love Mandalay Bay," her co-pilot answered, and the super stallion tilted slightly back upwards, now facing just enough away from the ground so Emily could see the big golden-windowed building ahead. Emily, however, was still looking down at the ground, as well as her boots scrabbling on the steel interior beside the gunner window. "No Mandalay Bay! No Mandalay Bay!" Emily screeched, now hugging the M2 machine gun for both physical and spiritual comfort. She was only answered by more witchy Gorgon laughter, and the super stallion did a wide circle around the back end of the towering building. The move was twofold, as since they were still low to the ground, their prop wash wreaked havoc down below on many an umbrella and comfortably snoozing pool lounger. With another bushel of innocent bystanders now scrubbed with their prop wash, the stone serenade ignored the angry radio orders from the Las Vegas airport and continued on their arranged flight plan towards Logan. Emily heaved a sigh of relief, still attached to the M2 and rattling from nerves. Muriel leaned over and helped pry her away from the weapon, then helped her into the flight harness she didn't bother to put on properly before. The flight through Nevada was rather uneventful as flights go. The land was flat and mostly dry with no trees, which seemed to bore the two Gorgon pilots to death. Emily took to watching them fly and swore that the co-pilot had nodded off at one point, having a little snooze while her hair watched the gauges and flight path. Gritchenk was sipping coffee from a thermos, and Emily had watched as her hair's many heads flicked around, checking dials, tapping the radar screen, and one even leaning down and fixing her slightly askew aviators. The snake tendril opened its mouth, adjusted them around her slightly pointed ear, gave a nod, then turned, catching Emily staring at it. It flicked its forked tongue at her, and Emily swore she saw it narrow its eyes at her, as if she was being rude for staring. "Something wrong, Emily Bronze?" Gritchenk said, only slightly turning her head towards the human while bringing her thermos back up to her lips. Emily chewed on the question for a minute before clicking on her mic. "Do they like flying?" Morel gave Emily a weird look and cocked an eyebrow. "Well, yeah, Emily, the pilots." Gritchenk laughed softly in Emily's ears, and Emily leaned her head back, looking skyward in exasperation. "No, not those two. I'm talking about their hair." "Their hair?" Morel guffawed, but Emily heard no retort from Gritchenk for a few moments. Morel made little snake mouths with her hands and held them near her hair, making little talking motions with them and hissing at her with her tongue between her teeth. "They like to fly," Gritchenk said quietly, barely audible in the earmuffs, and Emily turned her head to look at the Gorgon, only to instead find multiple pairs of tiny eyes looking at her. She could even barely see a warm hazel eye looking her way from under the aviators. As Gritchenk had turned her head just enough to catch a glance at Emily. "They have an important job. They watch the gauges, the radar, and may see things I do not." Emily watched the many little eyes as Gritchenk turned back to her controls, having been steering with her knees as she drank from her coffee thermos. She gave a little wave, and some of the tendrils swayed a little in answer. "Do they have names?" Emily asked, and Morel again squinted at Emily, wrinkling her nose and mouthing "What?" at her. Tinkling laughter answered her this time, and some of her eyes looked as sheepishly as tiny snakes could. "No, they are me. They share my name. However, I do have favorites." Some of the snaky hair strands looked indignantly at one strand, which had sharp green eyes, unlike the others, and Emily had no idea that hair could be smug, of all things. She watched as Gritchenk reached up and gave it a little stroke, and the smugness stayed put while the others looked jealous. Well, some of them did. The strands watching the radar gave a glance at what was going on and seemed not to care for the inter-scout politics going on at the current moment. Emily scooted forward and reached out towards the others who were not petted, giving her fingers a wiggle. "How smart are they? I mean, they look just like halves of snakes. Do they have a brain and such?" "Some of them do," Gritchenk replied with a grin, and the one snaky hair tendril Emily was reaching for lowered its eyelids. It did not seem to appreciate the joke as much as Gritchenk, and slid back away from Emily's hand, instead going back to monitoring a retrofitted oil gauge. Morel was watching Emily and Gritchenk and seemed to not enjoy the amount of attention that Emily was giving to the Gorgon. She keyed up her own mic and leaned forward to look around the corner into the flight cabin. "Isn't it true those things are venomous? I read that they can bite on their own accord to defend themselves." Morel watched as Emily jerked her hand back and felt satisfied. "This is true. Actually, if we are somehow knocked unconscious or cannot defend ourselves, a Gorgon's hair can perform a sort of last stand, drawing poison from our own fangs and injecting it with their own." Emily perked up again and keyed up her mic. "Wait, does that mean all Gorgons are poisonous?" Morel growled in her throat, keying up her own mic. "Yes, all of them are venomous, Emily." "Not always," Gritchenk murmured, and some of her own hair nodded in agreement. "While the majority of Gorgons are venomous, some Gorgons have specialized hair, such as some that are longer can grab hold firmly and keep prey in place till the Gorgon can get her own fangs on them. There are also Gorgons with spitting hair, hair that can track heat, or scent better than other Gorgons, and some special types that can see further than their own host." Emily looked on in fascination while Morel grumped, crossing her arms and swishing her horsey tail angrily. Gritchenk's hair seemed to be preening and being talked about, somehow proud of their ancient ancestry despite being passengers the entire way. Gritchenk's co-pilot snorted away, startling her own snaky tendrils, who quickly busied themselves with looking like they were working and not nodding off themselves. "We there yet?" the Gorgon said, sniffing and sitting up straighter. "We're not even outside Las Vegas suburbs properly. How do you even fall asleep so quickly?" Properly yawned, which caused a wave of yawning all along her hair as their mouths opened wide and wiggled.
Yeesh, take so long, flat entire way there. Can't wait till mountains, then real fun begin.
Emily was not sure what Properly meant by fun, but quietly wished that the flat desert topography would last longer and longer, but could not ignore the mountains looming in the distance ahead. Her nightmares became truth when she heard Properly give a gleeful giggle and felt the bird lurch upwards as the Gorgon pulled up on the collective, bringing them right along the spine of a hill that led up into the mountains. Only Muriel and Gretchen seemed to share the sentiment, while Emily plastered herself to the corner of the gun deck as if she were a spider trying to hide on the corner of the ceiling and wall. She noted that she seemed to be the only one screaming in terror, for as far as she was concerned, helicopters usually traveled in a flare plane, not the suicidal high angles that the Gorgons seemed to favor. As soon as they came over the top of the hill, the super stallion then dove over the side of it, ducking down into the path of a river in between two tree-filled banks. Emily wasn't sure how low they were since she could only see trees, but when the super stallion banked in order to follow the river, she could almost make out fish in the clear river below. Emily spared a hand to key up her mic. "What about the trees?" Gretchen chuckled, whipping the super stallion onto its other side and coursing along the river's path.
Emily Bruns, we have blades. They will just chop through the trees that get in our way.
"That is not what they are for!" Emily howled while Muriel laughed merrily and had the gall to lean out the window for a better view, anchoring herself with the weight of her other half. Emily did not risk looking up and over the gunnery cutout as the bird lurched and roared down the path of the river, the craft rocking back and forth so much that she swore at one point they must have been floating on the river itself. When the water had run its course into another set of mountains, the Gorgons pitched it up, flying so low to the ground that the prop wash of its blades ripped leaves from the tops of trees as it ascended up the side of the mountain. The Gorgon pilots decided to have a little wicked fun, as when the super stallion peeked over the top of the mountain, they rolled towards Emily's side and followed a path down into a small valley, causing the human to float momentarily before slamming back down onto her position on the seat, floor, corner of the fighting compartment. All three of the non-human passengers thought that she did an impressive imitation of a harpy war cry, and made it known over the inter-vehicle communication system. The abuse hurled back at them from Emily only fueled their laughter, and Muriel poked her head back outside to throw Emily an adrenaline-fueled grin. The flight continued in this manner for some time until they entered another airspace and were asked to fly low to the valley to avoid low-flying harpies and dragons that were going about their deliveries, and maybe resting in the mountains. This tower seemed to have a good rapport with the Gorgons, as they complied with little hissing to go about it. This also allowed Emily a moment to actually breathe and shakily get back up from the floor where she had been nested, quietly hoping that a tree didn't gouge out the bottom of the super stallion and send her tumbling to the ground. "Aw, that all we get?" Muriel asked as she keyed up her mic, pulling her head back inside. The wind had blown her braid to smithereens, and her long black hair was now whipping around her as if trying to mimic the hair of the Gorgon pilots. Gretchen answered as Prappily took the bird into a graceful turn, following around the toes of a large range of hills and keeping just above the tree line again.
They ask so nicely, so we oblige. Don't worry, Centaur, we still have to go up and over a few more times. I'll make it interesting.
Muriel held up her fist and hissed, "Yeah!" into the mic, while Emily felt her stomach lurch just at the thought of them doing another mountain bomb dive. She needed some air and poked her head out just enough to catch some of the wind coming in, breathing in deeply to try and get the taste of rising bile from her nose. She came close to spewing her breakfast all over the floor a few times, but was able to swallow it back down just like she had on the airplane ride in. Muriel saw her huffing down lungfuls of air and cocked her head. "You doing okay over there, Emily?" she asked and crossed her arms in an almost smug manner. Emily slowly dragged her eyes to Muriel's, head still tilted upwards and hands holding white-knuckled onto the M2 machine gun. "Dandy. You? Bet you don't like Gorgons too much now, huh?" Emily dragged her eyes away from the centaur and out the window to the mountains and trees rushing by.
"My enthusiasm may have been curbed by recent events."
Gretchen and Prappily chuckled over the mic, and Emily keyed it up once again.
"Keep laughing. I may be billing you for my underwear."
Emily and Muriel smiled while the two Gorgons hooted with laughter. The trip continued on until it no longer could, and instead of landing at the Logan airport from whence they had first departed, instead chose to land in the middle of the vehicle depot behind the main company building. Jamesha happened to be out that day, fussing about with his beloved monobike, the Harlot, and walked out of the vehicle bay she was parked to investigate as to why he was getting an incoming warning on his internal radar. The Gorgons expertly brought the Super Stallion down in the parade space between the two larger depots, spinning the bird around so Emily could take her bike out towards the open bay where Jamesha was watching. This was throwing up a lot of dust, naturally, and a neatly swept pile of leaves Jamesha was going to bag was now blown across the concrete. His metallic skull watched the leaves go, and he clicked his teeth in annoyance. Muriel trotted out first, waving to Jamesha and jogging towards him, while Emily wobbled down the ramp with her bike. Emily saw Jamesha and hung her head, and just knew he was going to say something about how sweaty she was. The ride through town had been just as harrying as the one through Las Vegas, and a close encounter with the Piper Club had almost made her heart rip its way out of her chest and hand her its resignation. The stone serenade gave another spin, allowing the two Gorgons to wave at them before they took off. Jamesha glared as best he could, arms crossed. Muriel waved cheerily, and Emily glowered over her shoulder at them, her hair plastered to her forehead and shoulders hunched as she gripped her Zundap's handlebars. Emily saw the two Gorgons laughing toothily from under their aviators, and the stone serenade lifted up and away from the vehicle depot, plastering those below in prop wash and engine exhaust. The trip was silent as they watched the Super Stallion make its way skyward, and the metallic man looked over at Muriel.
Fun flight, Muriel?
Oh yeah, I think those two brought whirlybirds into a new light for me. Never knew why they could bank that hard and roll. They rolled it like they would a fixed wing. Most fun I've ever had in a helicopter. Muriel chirped, dusting off the past Harpy sling bag and then the rest of her bags she had carried off the craft. Jamesha then turned to look at Emily, who was quietly panting with her eyes closed, a bead of sweat dripping off her nose onto the leather seat below.
And how did you enjoy the flight, Emily? Or did the helicopter hit a pothole as well?
Emily slid her eyes open, and she slowly turned her head towards Jamesha. He may have been a giant, stupid, cyborg robot man, but he sure could lay on the T's when it came to his robotic voice.
"Don't you worry about me, Tin Man. I'm doing just fine,"
she said, showing her teeth at him in a light grinning snarl. Jamesha stared at her, unblinking, but she could tell he was definitely laughing at her on the inside.
Well, I'll take care of your bike. Ogledock wanted to see you as soon as you landed. Muriel, you too.
Muriel suddenly looked a little less cheerful, pointing at herself. Me? Why me? I'm the victim here. She's the one who slapped on a magical necklace and murked an entire goon squad.
You failed to follow Company Field Protocol 42216 Bravo. Proper armament when in the field,
Jamesha said shortly, and slowly rubbed an index finger across the other.
Tisk, tisk.
Muriel was stricken. But I almost got 8!
But you didn't, and now you must be yelled at,
Jamesha said with mirth, then turned to Emily.
Especially you,
he said again, and brushed a leaf from Emily's shoulder, having gotten stuck in her neckline.
Ogledock has been raving ever since you sent him the email. I've never seen him turn such colors.
Emily sighed and thumped her head down onto the handlebars of her Zundap with a hollow thud.
Ugh, God. Was the ride here not enough for him?
Jamesha hissed openly in laughter and patted her on the shoulder.
Of course not. There's far worse to come. Probably.
And that would be the end of Chapter 7, Part 2. Did you guys like the Gorgons? They were fun to voice. If you guys liked the video, however, feel free to comment down below, like the video, or subscribe if you want to see more. And if you'd like to support our content, feel free to give us a donation down at the Ko-fi link below. This has been Guardbeardia.
YouTube is taking us to the fucking cleaners right now, and I cannot figure out why. I think they just like to see me suffer. See us all suffer. They grow on our suffering. Why do they want to see us suffer? And you just want to write up waifus and have a fun time. I just want to make stories. Why do you hate me, YouTube?
All those moments will be lost in time.